Hey, welcome back to How We Got Here, the channel where we uncover the real stories behind the world you live in. If you're new here, hit subscribe because by the end of this video, you'll see the map of Africa completely differently. Look at a map of Africa. Notice anything strange? The borders are straight, unnaturally straight, ruler on a map straight. Africa has 54 countries, more than any other continent. And huge stretches of those borders are just lines cutting through deserts, rivers, and mountains. Lines that split villages in half. Lines that separate families who speak the same language and worship the same gods. European borders follow rivers, mountain ranges, centuries of wars and treaties between people who actually live there. But Africa's borders look like someone took a ruler and just drew lines on a map. And that's basically what happened. This is the story of how a room full of Europeans who had never set foot in Africa sat around a table in Berlin, pulled out a map, and carved up an entire continent like a birthday cake. No Africans were invited, no Africans were consulted, and the consequences are still shaping the world today. Before Europeans drew their lines, Africa wasn't some empty, unorganized wilderness. That's a colonial myth worth destroying right now. Africa was home to some of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history. The Kingdom of Congo had complex political systems and international trade networks as early as the 1400s. The Ashanti Empire in West Africa was a military and economic powerhouse. The Ethiopian Empire was one of the oldest continuous states on Earth. The Zulu Kingdom dominated southern Africa with one of the most effective fighting forces the continent had ever seen. There were hundreds of kingdoms, empires, city-states, and tribal territories with their own borders, governments, and laws. These borders weren't random. They followed ethnic lines, geographic features, trade routes, and centuries of negotiation and conflict between African peoples. In fact, Africa, before colonialism, was arguably more politically diverse than Europe. There were vast empires and tiny city-states, democratic councils and absolute monarchies, nomadic confederations, and settled agricultural kingdoms. It was a continent of enormous complexity. But to the Europeans, none of this mattered. Africa was a resource, a prize, and by the late 1800s, they were racing to grab as much of it as they could. This race had a name, the Scramble for Africa, and it was exactly as chaotic as it sounds. European nations were industrializing at breakneck speed. They needed raw materials, rubber for tires, cotton for textiles, gold, diamonds, copper, ivory. Africa had all of it in staggering quantities. At the same time, European nations were competing with each other for global dominance. Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, and Spain were all eyeing the same territories. Explorers and missionaries were being sent deep into the African interior, planting flags, signing treaties with local leaders who often had no idea what they were agreeing to, and claiming land in the name of their kings and queens. By the early 1880s, it was getting dangerous. Britain and France were bumping into each other in West Africa. Portugal was clashing with Belgium in Central Africa. Germany, newly unified and hungry for an empire, was grabbing territory in East and Southwest Africa. Everyone was stepping on everyone else's toes, and the tension was building toward a potential war between European powers. Not over Europe, but over Africa. So in November 1884, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck invited representatives from 14 nations to Berlin. The official purpose was to settle disputes over the Congo River basin. The real purpose was simpler. They were going to divide Africa among themselves. The conference opened on November 15th, 1884, at Bismarck's residence on Wilhelmstrasse. Representatives from Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, and 9 other nations sat around a horseshoe-shaped table. On the wall behind them hung a large map of Africa. Not a single African was in the room. 14 nations were about to decide the fate of an entire continent, and nobody who actually lived there had any say whatsoever. The conference lasted about 3 months, ending on February 26, 1885. The key principle they agreed on was called effective occupation. Any European country could claim African territory, but only if they established a government there, had treaties with local leaders, and could demonstrate control. No more just planting a flag and walking away. This sounds reasonable until you realize what it actually did. It turned the scramble for Africa into an all-out sprint. Every European power now had a massive incentive to get boots on the ground, sign treaties as fast as possible, and establish control before someone else did. And here's the dark irony. The conference also declared a commitment to improving the well-being of African peoples and suppressing the slave trade. In reality, it did the exact opposite. Before Berlin, only about 20% of Africa was under European control. Within 5 years, that jumped to almost 90%. By 1914, virtually the entire continent had been carved up. Only 2 African nations remained independent: Ethiopia, which fought off Italian invasion, and Liberia, which had been founded by formerly enslaved Americans. Now, here's the part that still haunts Africa today. The way they drew these borders. They used rivers, latitude lines, longitude lines, sometimes just straight lines connecting 2 random points on a map. The British Prime Minister reportedly admitted they had been drawing lines on maps where no white man's feet had ever walked, giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, hindered only by the small problem that they didn't know where those mountains, rivers, and lakes actually were. These arbitrary borders split over 200 ethnic groups across multiple countries. The Maasai were divided between Kenya and Tanzania. The Ewe were split between Ghana, Togo, and Benin. The Somali people were scattered across 5 territories. The Malenge were broken up across 6 countries. Imagine being told your village is now in a different country than your mother's village 3 miles away, that you need a passport to visit your own family, that you now share a nation with people who speak a completely different language and have been your rivals for centuries. That happened to millions of Africans overnight. And it wasn't just splitting groups apart. The borders also forced completely unrelated, sometimes hostile groups into the same country. Nigeria alone contains over 250 ethnic groups. These weren't nations in any organic sense. They were administrative units designed for European convenience. No story better illustrates the horrors of the Scramble than the Congo. King Leopold II of Belgium personally claimed the entire Congo River basin as his private property, not Belgium's colony, his personal possession. An area roughly 1/3 the size of the United States, owned by one man. Leopold told Europe his goal was humanitarian, that he wanted to civilize the Congo and end the slave trade. They believed him. The Berlin Conference recognized his claim. What followed was one of the worst atrocities in modern history. Leopold established a brutal forced labor system to extract rubber and ivory. Congolese men, women, and children were enslaved. Those who didn't meet their rubber quotas were tortured, mutilated, or killed. His private army enforced production with systematic violence. Soldiers were required to account for every bullet they fired by presenting a severed hand as proof. Baskets of human hands became a symbol of the nightmare the Congo had become. The scale of death was staggering. The Congolese population was devastated under Leopold's rule. Villages were destroyed. Families were torn apart. An entire society was gutted for the profit of one European king who never once set foot in the Congo. And the Congo wasn't unique. All across the continent, colonial powers exploited African labor, extracted African resources, and dismantled African institutions. Then, starting in the 1950s, something remarkable happened. Africa fought back. Independence movements swept the continent. Ghana led the way in 1957, becoming the first sub-Saharan African nation to break free from colonial rule. Over the next 2 decades, country after country followed. By 1980, virtually all of Africa was free from direct European rule. But here's the cruel twist. When African nations gained independence, They inherited the borders the Europeans had drawn. Why not just redraw them? In 1963, the newly formed Organization of African Unity, the predecessor to today's African Union, made a controversial but practical decision. They agreed to respect existing colonial borders. The reasoning was painful but understandable. If every ethnic group tried to redraw lines along traditional boundaries, it would trigger hundreds of territorial disputes and potentially endless war across the entire continent. Better to keep the lines and try to build nations within them. But building a nation out of a colonial rectangle is incredibly difficult, and the consequences of the Berlin Conference are still visible everywhere you look. Civil wars, ethnic conflicts, border disputes, separatist movements. The Rwandan genocide of 1994, one of the most devastating events of the 20th century, was rooted in colonial strategies that elevated one ethnic group over another within borders never designed for the people living inside them. Research published in the American Economic Review found that ethnic homelands divided by colonial borders experience roughly 57% more political violence than undivided homelands. People in divided ethnic groups also face more government discrimination, worse access to public services, and lower standards of living. The borders drawn in Berlin didn't just divide land, they divided people, and those divisions are still bleeding today. So, the next time you look at a map of Africa and see those straight lines, remember what they really are. They aren't natural boundaries. They aren't the result of African history, African wars, or African negotiations. They were drawn by Europeans who had never been there, in a room where no African was present, at a conference where African voices were never heard. 54 countries, hundreds of split ethnic groups, over a century of conflict and instability, all because a group of men in Berlin decided that a continent of millions of people was theirs to divide. The map of Africa doesn't show you African history, it shows you European ambition. And that is how we got here. If you made it this far, hit subscribe and drop a comment. Did you know any of this? What topic should I cover next? I read every single comment. Smash that like button too. It helps the algorithm push this to more people. Next time, why does America have military bases in over 80 countries? The answer goes deeper than you think. Turn on notifications so you don't miss it. I'll see you in the next one.